Welcome to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Hello all. Welcome back to the Truth in My Days Apologetics Program. Today, we have Dr. Adrian Torres speaking with John Torres. Today, John is looking at when the Gospel books were published. We are continuing from the last episode. We hope you enjoy.
So, there they go. It became official. Matthew was dated to 130, Luke to 150, Mark to 160. And then in 1844, Bauer wrote that the Gospel, according to John, was written as a synthesis of Petrine and Pauline Christianity, and therefore could be dated no earlier than the year AD 160, but probably closer to AD 170. This was what they called the assured results of critical scholarship. It was accepted across the board by scholars, and you couldn't question it because this is scholarship.
But it was baseless. Do they still make those claims?
No, it did finally collapse, and it's quite interesting how that happened. It all came down to a small scrap of papyrus, old document, very small piece of one, actually, a fragment, that had been in storage at the John Rylands Library in England ever since somebody picked it up in the Middle East in the year 1920. It was not actually studied until 1935 when a papyrologist named Colin H. Roberts took a look at it and realized that it was actually a piece from the Gospel according to John, specifically several verses from chapter 18. Now, it had been studied by a number of experts, and now they took another look at it after Roberts identified it, and they dated it to the year somewhere between AD 110 and 135. Could have been earlier, as early as 98 perhaps. And eventually they began closing in on around the year AD 100, though more recently now liberal scholars are again trying to move the date of this manuscript later.
How did they date it?
They dated what's called paleographically, and paleographic just means old writing. Different scribes who would copy these manuscripts by hand had different styles of writing, and it would vary from era to era, and that still happens. If you look at the handwriting of somebody today compared to the handwriting of somebody in, say, the Civil War times, you will notice it's very, very different. And so scholars have collected many samples of ancient manuscripts from different periods, many of which include a date inside the document itself. And so we know when that came from. And so they've built up this ladder essentially of different writing styles in the different eras. And it's not so precise that you could get it down to an exact year, but you get a reasonable estimate of the date at which a manuscript was copied by the writing style.
Why couldn't they date it by carbon-14 dating?
Well, one obvious reason was carbon-14 dating hadn't been invented yet. That was invented by Libby in the 1940s. Secondly, there are a lot of problems with carbon dating. There's a lot of unknowns, assumptions you need to make, and so on. It's a destructive testing material process as well. You have to actually destroy some of the sample in order to test it. Now, recently we've developed better methods that are not so destructive, but so in those days they were. But the big problem is you can only date if you ignore the problems intrinsic to radiometric dating. The other big problem is you can only date the material it's written on and not the writing itself.
Wouldn't they be about the same?
Not necessarily. They could actually be very different, and there's no way to know. Consider the very important manuscript that's called Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus. And this is codex, that means it's in a book form, not a scroll. And on this manuscript are Greek translations of 38 treatises written by a 4th century theologian named Ephraim the Syrian. And these treatises were copied onto the parchment material that the document is made out of in the 12th century. Now, rescriptus means rewritten. Why? Well, because parchment, vellum, the top quality writing material of the day was very expensive. And so you'd often actually reuse it. You take your piece of parchment, you'd wash off the original writing, and then write something new on top of it. When you find a manuscript like that, it's called a palimpsest. And that was the case here with Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus. Underneath the treatises, scholars identified a copy of the New Testament, missing a couple of books, but most of it there, some books from the Old Testament as well. And this earlier writing came from the 5th century. The upper writing then on this palimpsest was at least 7 centuries younger than the parchment. So if somebody had just taken the manuscript, did a carbon-14 dating on it, dated it to the 5th century, they would assume that the writing on top was also from the 5th century, when in fact it came from 7 centuries later. So no, you can't assume that the writing has the same date as the material, and so carbon-14 dating is generally not used to date manuscripts.
Okay, but if you wash off the writing, are you saying that you can see the writing from centuries ago that was washed off on the vellum?
You could see it because it's difficult, certainly with their washing, to get rid of all of it. The ink would seep into the lower layers of the parchment. And yeah, you couldn't completely excise it. Now when we use ultraviolet light on it, we can see all kinds of stuff underneath that we couldn't see before.
Very interesting. So Roberts found a piece from the Gospel according to John that dated to AD 100 to 135. Why was that so significant?
Well, think about it. Remember that Bauer, F.C. Bauer, told us that the Gospel according to John could be dated no earlier than AD 160, but probably closer to AD 170. And he told us that this was the assured results of critical scholarship. Assured results mean you can't question it. This is what all the scholars accepted, the professors. This is what we're told. This is certain. You can't question it. Now, suddenly, a manuscript from the Gospel according to John comes along, dated somewhere between 100 and 135. So which came first, AD 135 or AD 160?
I see. So this was hard evidence that Bauer's dates were wrong.
Spectacularly so. And remember, we were told AD 160 at the earliest, the assured results of critical scholarship, and now they're blown out of the water. They're clearly wrong. What should this have done to the credibility of so-called critical scholarship?
Well, it should have demolished it, and people should understand that these scholars don't always know what they're talking about just because they're professors in universities.
Exactly. Those claims of Bauer were never built on substance. It was picked up by people who wanted to go along with it and help discredit the New Testament. And now the least bit of hard evidence came along that destroyed its assured results. So it should have demolished liberal scholarship. Nobody should be taking it seriously.
But it wasn't demolished, was it?
No, it's sadly to say it wasn't. There are too many people with a vested interest in discrediting the New Testament, and they're quite shameless about this. They would go on to their next view and again present it as the assured results of critical scholarship. They would make these other assertions with equal confidence and equal lack of evidence. It is their stock in trade to this day. Their claims continue to be published, widely disseminated in news magazines and TV documentaries. Now, you'll see them in Time Magazine, Newsweek, Maclean's, and so on. And those who read such articles carefully and pay attention see that all you ever find in these articles are bald assertions. But the assertions are made by people who have doctrine for their name, people who are professors, they're touted as experts. And so people tend to just accept what's there, even though they never see actual evidence for the claims.
Really, there's nothing new under the sun. I can see such things happening today in front of our eyes. But still, the discovery of P52 must have done something to Bauer's late date claims.
Oh, certainly. With the Gospel according to John being the last one published, and having to have been published before this P52 copy was made, liberal scholars were forced to concede that all of the gospel books were in fact published in the 1st century.
That's huge. That means it is not possible to remove them from eyewitness times.
Exactly. Jesus died, rose, and ascended to heaven in the year AD 33. So from there to the end of the century is 67 years. So the maximum possible date of a gospel book would be 67 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. And even that, 67 years, sounds like a long time, but it is well within eyewitness memory. Liberal skeptics, of course, want to emphasize that this is such a long period of time. How could people possibly remember accurately over such a long period of time? And they want to cast the impression that you really can't trust something written long after the time. But the reality is that the older one gets, the farther back he can remember. Certainly significant events, and maybe not what he ate for breakfast on a particular day 50 years ago, but significant events, like say a wedding, they can remember that. For me at my age, I can remember back at least 50 years, no problem. My mom can remember back 75 to 80 years. And still, though, people don't think about that. They tend to hear, oh, the gospel books were in 30 years later, 40 years later, 65 years later, and they think, hey, yeah, people can't remember. But they can.
I see a bit of a problem here, though. I mean, assuming the eyewitnesses were adults, 67 years later will make them really old. I mean, do people live that long in those days?
People lived that long in those days. We have this idea that life in the Roman Empire was a lot shorter. The lifespan was quite a bit shorter, but it was shorter because a lot of children died at a very young age. Women died in childbirth. Men who were in the military died young. If you remove those, in fact, you don't die in childbirth, you don't die as a young child, you're not in the military, your chances of living to ripe old age were pretty much as good as they are today. Contemporary writers talk about 60 years as being the beginning of old age.
Thank you, everyone, for listening today. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but please join us for the next part tomorrow. Same time and same place. If you enjoy our content and think this is important material, the best compliment you can pay is by sharing this with your friends and family. This helps us out a lot. Also, if you enjoyed today's program, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to this podcast. We would love to hear from you. Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. We would love to hear from you. Please feel free to share any questions or comments you may have. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, MeWe, and YouTube. Simply search Truth in My Days as one word. Again, Truth in My Days as one word, no spaces in between. And you can connect with us. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com. Thank you.